So good evening, everybody. I'd like to call this Lake Forest Park City Council Committee of the Whole to order for Monday. What is the date today? 24th. Yes, thank you. April 24th, 2023. And we're going to start with citizen comments. Is there anyone? That would be Sarah Phillips. Please join us. Welcome.
Hi, my name's Sarah Phillips. I live at 18533 26th Avenue Northeast, and I'm here to support the ban on natural gas for new construction. It really is a critically important piece that we begin to reduce our gas consumption in Lake Forest Park, and this is a really critically important way. We now call it fracked gas. Natural gas being the public relations tool, language of the gas industry. Fracked gas is a problem from the beginning, where it is fracked and the importation of a toxic chemical mess into the water and into the ground levels in places where gas is being fracked. It's also a problem when it comes into houses. We know that well, it's a problem with CO2 emissions. It's also a problem with if it's in cooking. What we're finding now is that natural gas emissions from stovetops are a significant cause of asthma and other health issues. And anything we can do that gets both those things at the same time, both reduces the CO2 emissions and enhances the health of our citizens, it's a good thing. And I encourage you to support the ban. And the other thing is it's going to be easier because Shoreline's done it, Seattle's done it. We can begin to move as a whole regional area on the issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Is there anyone else? Maybe in the wings, in the atrium? No, online that would like to make public comment. I don't see any attendees out there. Matt, anybody that I'm missing?
No, there's no one online.
Okay, with that, we'll close public comment. Thank you, Sarah. And with that, we're going to move on to the discussion items. The first one is the natural gas ban for new construction. Councilmember Furtani has very graciously put together a quick presentation for us. And first discussion to see if there's any interest amongst the colleagues.
The microphones are.
They are on demand. So yes.
All right, thank you very much, Deputy Mayor, and thank you, Council, for entertaining this idea. As Sarah Phillips just mentioned, there's been some work done in other cities nearby about banning natural gas in new construction, specifically commercial and multifamily residential. And I think it's time for us to start looking at something like that. So I just want to broach this topic, get a feel of how you are thinking about this. So I've got a quick presentation that Matt's kindly put up on the screen. Well, I'll talk my way through it. In any case, oh, there it is. Okay, wonderful. Okay. So the point is that natural gas, for those of you in the audience who don't know, it's methane gas, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. It's 80 times more efficient at trapping heat than carbon dioxide is. Fortunately, its lifetime in the atmosphere is a lot shorter than carbon dioxide is, but nevertheless, as we continue to consume the gas, it builds up in our atmosphere. So I wanted to show you a couple of slides that show the benefits and the concerns. The benefits are, of course, reducing our greenhouse gas inventory and output. And the point is that the significant amount of our greenhouse gas inventory, as you may have seen from another presentation, is from home heating, as well as using it for heating our water. So the point is that we could reduce significantly our carbon footprint in the city. Another thing that Sarah alluded to is that there's health benefits, especially in low-income communities and Black communities where asthma is more prevalent than in the larger population. The gases that are contained with the natural gas sometimes exacerbate the effects of asthma. And so that's a significant CDC report on this if you'd like to find out more. And then finally, reduce costs. And this one is a little bit weirder just because electricity costs different in different parts of the country. For us, I don't think it's as much of a reduced cost as it is for, say, Southern California or someplace like that. But nevertheless, the savings that we get in terms of money for heat pumps versus, say, traditional heating methods is not insignificant. All right, some of the concerns are, as you may have heard from when Shoreline was enacting the ban, they got a significant turnout from the pipe fitters union because, of course, a lot of those jobs depend on being able to work on natural gas pipelines in the city. So there's one concern. Another one is reducing city revenues because we get a significant number of permits for natural gas appliances. And of course, we wouldn't have those. And then finally, and probably the most, to me, the one that I think about the most is the single source of heating concept, which is if we had a prolonged outage and everybody was relying on electricity, how could we basically keep people warm, avoiding hypothermia? We are having more extreme weather events where we have longer cold snaps, and that is a concern. So don't have a good answer for that. All right, I just wanted to show you, this is from Bellingham's ordinance that they introduced. There's a lot of whereases here. Oops, sorry. My bad. Okay, no, that's all right. Okay, I sometimes do that. It's got a hair trigger. All right, so the whereases here, I don't need you to read, but just showing you all the justifications that a lot of cities have for enacting these kinds of bans, and they range from the scientific, in terms of global warming and concerns about climate change, to health effects, to basically just simply being a bit more conscious about what kind of footprint we leave on the earth. So there's something in it for everybody here. All right, so to get to the actual legislation itself, it does seem that there's kind of a standard playbook, which is in the building energy codes for each city, there are specific sections that have to do with what the source of the energy for the heating is. And so this is, you'll see that the numbers are always the same. It's C403 1.4. And this is about the source of energy for home heating. And simply put, it's banning fossil fuel burning. And this one is the one from Shoreline, and it was passed in December 2021. And similarly, C404.2.3 is about home hot water heating. And again, banning fossil fuels from being used in that. Now, this was also from the Shoreline Code, passed as part of the same ordinance in 2021. But the point that I want to make here is that it does seem to be almost boilerplate language. I hate to use that term because it seems like there's no thought behind it. I'm certain there's thought behind it because there are a lot of exceptions to each of these to allow, for instance, the continued use of cooking heating sources as gas and things like that, which seem to be tailored for each city. And so that's a place that I think we can have our say as to what's right for Lake Forest Park. And so the broad stroke is to ban the natural gas and then put in the exceptions to allow certain kinds of use of natural gas. Here's the one for the city of Bellingham, which was passed in 2022. And again, the wording is in the main part of the ordinance is exactly the same as the Shoreline one, as is the home heating of water, the heating, hot water heating gas sources. And I didn't pull Seattle's, but Seattle's has exactly the same language as well. And they've modified theirs to be even stronger. And so I didn't want to put it up here just to not cause a great deal of confusion, but just to show you the fact that each of these cities seems to be pulling from the same section of code and using basically the same language to enact this natural gas ban. And it's always on new commercial and new multifamily residential, since the state still has control over heating sources for single family residential. All right, so one of the potential issues that my colleague Larry Goldman brought up is that Berkeley recently had its natural gas ban. The city of Berkeley in California had its natural gas ban reversed by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals on the grounds that the suit was brought by the California Restaurant Association. And there were restaurant owners who still wanted to continue to use gas appliances for their cooking. And the court ruled that the city didn't have the right to regulate the energy sources, even though the city tried to argue that it was the delivery of the energy that they were trying to regulate. So the court bought into the argument that the Restaurant Association brought. And I think for us, I don't think it's going to be as significant because one of the exceptions that's carved out in these, the Shoreline and Bellingham ones for sure, is that there's got to be an electrical outlet next to where there will be a gas outlet hookup, which does imply that the gas outlet hookup is still okay. It's just that you need to be able to provide an alternate electrical source for the cooking appliance when needed. So I think we can kind of split a hair there. Oh, sorry. And that's pretty much it.
Oh,
Okay.
my apologies.
Okay.
We can come back to this in a second. I'd like to revisit the legal question. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
Yeah, my only thoughts are that I think. Okay, I gotta get it used to this situation. The only thoughts that I have beyond that are that it does serve equity in the city in the sense that we are going to try to institute this in a way which doesn't penalize people who can't afford heat pumps and things like that. So there are a lot of programs that are coming online as a result of federal legislation as well as the state budget that will allow us to hopefully be able to point people at subsidies for a lot of these major changes. And again, because this is for new construction, I'm thinking that the one concern that I have significantly is, we're trying to think of affordable housing as well. And how do we institute this with our ADU and DADU requirements and try to still basically make those units affordable for people? So I haven't worked out all these kinds of details, but these are some of the concerns that I have.
Vice Chair Cassidy.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I just want to clarify because I was taking notes furiously, and I seem to have a conflict here. Did you say that the state still has control over single family codes? And if so, what codes can the city or did I mishear that?
No, oops, I forgot. Yeah. So you didn't mishear me. My understanding is, and we don't have our legal counsel here, but is that the city has jurisdiction over heating sources in commercial and multifamily residential, but not over single family residential.
Thank you. Councilmember Bodie.
Thank you very much. This is something I think requires us, even though other cities have gone ahead, to look at carefully and think through, because eventually there'll be implications for single family homes, as well as, incentives perhaps for existing construction. So a couple of questions. First of all, so suppose you have, like I do, my bathroom's really cold, so I have a little supplemental electric resistance heater, which I only turn on, for 10 or 15 minutes at a time. So I just want to flag that issue. What about, suppose it's an apartment building and you happen to like your bathroom warm. So I just will flag that. Second of all, what about natural gas fireplaces? Are they not banned by this? The way I read it didn't seem to cover that. But if they heat your house, they're banned. So I flagged that issue. I assume these are all things people have dealt with before. And then the last thing, I know people who have looked at electric heat pumps versus these oil-filled electric baseboards, and actually for cost and also because they believe they're energy efficient, have gotten not the electric resistance coil baseboards, but the oil-filled ones. And so question is that still banned by this, because this also bans electric resistance heat. And then is a conventional hot water heater electric resistance? And so is this saying you have to get a more expensive kind of electric hot water heater? Last but not least, I'll say, even in the Northwest, where we're lucky to have so much hydropower, we get to the point where it's all used up. And so be it for load following purposes, because hydropower, solar and wind are all variable resources. We tend to still use natural gas to fill in the gaps. So our utility, Seattle City Light, Puget Power, our utilities will still, in generating electricity, use natural gas for the time being till they come up with a better solution to fill in the gaps. And that isn't really, doesn't affect the ordinance, but I just wanted to share that. So this puts more load on the utility, but then the utility is still providing the services to us, using some natural gas to fill in their gaps because it's dispatchable, right? So perhaps battery technology will at some point help us do that. But right now, or pump storage, I've heard people talk about, which was an idea that failed many in the 70s, but has been resurrected. Or, you know, small scale nuclear power plants. I've also read about those. There's a company in Oregon that's doing some like compartmental little small units of nuclear power generation that you can bundle together or unbundle. So I'm more just flagging that for awareness than raising it as an issue about the ordinance. So thank you. I thought it was very helpful, and I'm interested to see what the city that has done this the longest ago, what their experience is. So I assume that could be Seattle or Bellingham. You know, what's their experience been? Bellingham might be a good analogy for us. So, you know, what's their experience been? Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Goldman.
Yeah, thanks for presenting this. I'm broadly supportive. I am disappointed to learn that we don't have authority over single family, because in the city, that is the majority of our residences are single family units. I guess flagging some questions. The missing middle housing bill that passed for a city our size would basically be duplexes. So I'm curious if duplexes count as single family state control or multifamily local control. So that's something I'd be curious about. And also, I imagine we're going to come back to it, but getting legal ramifications from the Berkeley decision and kind of get a feel for, you know, how that might impact us. And of course, it's in flux because Berkeley may appeal that decision to the Supreme Court. So it's hard to, you know, nothing's definite yet, but broadly, I am supportive.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Riddle.
Thank you. So I have some thoughts on this, and in general, I think it's a great intent. And I think it's always about the execution and what we actually get out of it. And I think one of the things that I always struggle with is these individual municipalities. We're trying, right? But a lot of the natural gas that we get is due to oil drilling for crude oil. And so if we don't use that natural gas, it's more than likely going to be flared off at the site of drilling, because a lot of what we get isn't specifically wells or drills that are going from natural gas, which is really, so I think as a community, in order to look at that balance, I think it's also looking at improving our EV vehicle infrastructure and pairing this policy with other policies that support overall a lower reliance on all of our sort of fossil fuels. Thank you. My brain was going to say natural fuels because I had natural gas and fossil fuels stuck together in my brain, and you saw that, so I appreciate that. So I think that's just something to keep in mind. Bringing our natural gas consumption down only really helps when we can also bring down our oil and other fossil fuel consumption. The other thing is, has any concerns in these other communities come up around increased sound from additional heat pumps? I know that some of my neighbors have them, but I think with sound, as you get more and more of the same sound, it can kind of, the sound decibel levels start to go up. And there's something for us to remember about that. And if that's, again, something that we're going to want to address in future policies, and limiting the volume of these heat pumps, so there's the sound volume of these heat pumps, if there's a way we could do that. And again, I'm thinking more single family, people who want to opt in to getting out of natural gas. And then looking at our electrical infrastructure. And if we're talking about bringing more EV infrastructure on board, and now we're having heat pumps with electric. And what does this look like with PSE, and how does this start? How can they assure us, and how? So let's get some information from them in the long run if we're going to go this direction, because I certainly don't want us worrying about capacity issues, because we're at the end of their line. So, you know, it's kind of like if things don't get out this far, we see ourselves have a lot of power outages with trees down and stuff. I just don't want this to be another thing that causes us issues. And this is a really minor one, but I know that cooking with a wok takes a lot of high heat that's really focused on it. And frankly, gas is just really good for that. And induction doesn't really give you the same. Electric burner doesn't, you know. And so I want us to be culturally sensitive that this doesn't create this unintended consequence to hurt that community, that we're like, well, you can't cook the way you want to cook because of our decisions. So I want us to be culturally sensitive to that. And I don't know what that means, but I want us to keep that in the back of our mind as we move through these types of energy policies. So I think that was all of the thoughts I had. Thank you for listening.
Mr. Lebo.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm generally very supportive of this, and climate change is an existential threat to our grandchildren and their grandchildren. And it is methane. It's like calling it natural oil. I mean, come on. It's pretty good marketing when you call it natural. So I'm generally supportive of it, and whether we have the infrastructure or not, we need to recognize the issues that we're dealing with, and the infrastructure will catch up. And so we're not going to break the infrastructure at Lake Forest Park. What we can do is break the cycle of continually polluting the only world that we live on.
If I may, just unless you want to respond to his.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you, Deputy Mayor. And just really quickly, the first question that was asked when the Seattle ordinance came before the City Council in Seattle was, do we have the capacity to do this? And Seattle City Light resoundingly said yes. We are even selling our excess power to the grid and, you know, to the Western tie system. So I think the capacity issue isn't really as much of an issue. Now, all the other questions you have are absolutely valid points, and I've got to do some research very clearly, but at least the capacity issue, I think I can confidently say that there is capacity for these.
Thank you, Mr. Furtani.
As I said, capacity is different than peak dispatchable. So I will just say, so whether it's air conditioning, whether it's air conditioning or heating peak, capacity is the base. But the peak is the, you know, so that's the kind of the average, and the peak is the up and down. So I do think there's opportunity to use like plugged in electrical vehicles as that battery, you know, but we haven't created that infrastructure. But as Councilmember Lebo says, maybe if you build it, they will come. So just flag that issue, though, that they're still probably going to be using natural gas for peak here and there.
Just a couple of thoughts from my perspective. And thank you. First of all, I want to start by thanking our colleague, Mr. Furtani, for bringing this to us. I think it's I am also broadly supportive of this. I think that there are a lot of questions to be answered. I really appreciate your dedication to looking at the sort of cookie cutter approach to this, because I think there's an opportunity for us to be much more sensitive to the nuances of things that could be problematic, cultural issues, as Councilmember Riddle mentioned, and other things, peak issues. We are served by a variety of different grids, and some of you who you may remember that the previous body, this council dragged the Seattle City Light chief operating officer in front of in this chambers after we experienced a series of outages that were quite catastrophic to this community. And since then, it's been much better. My neighborhood, for example, is down to about 2 per year, as opposed to on average almost a dozen. I can't say the same of Council Vice Chair Cassover's neighborhood. I'm not sure what's going on up there, but that's another thing we need to look at. And again, those are sort of hyper local kinds of things. But when they brought in the additional trunk line from Seattle City Light from another direction, that really helped the broader community, probably close to 65, 70%. I also appreciate the sensitivity to housing. What does it really look at like with these various middle housing things? I mean, Cindy was it today? I think it was today. They're done. So there are some things we'll be talking about in the future here about what passed 1337 and 1110 and a variety of other things that are that we want to make sure that there's that there is fairness when it comes to, and there's not increased cost when it comes to some of these new opportunities that are out there, that because that is really a critical component. So and the other thing I wanted to say too, the question of I believe you brought this up. I think you did. Maybe you did. I'm sorry. I apologize. I'm a little tired. I've been wrangling the small human for the last couple of days. The question of primary heating for a fireplace versus a decorative kind of thing. There is, you know, I think that's something that really needs to be split off. Similarly, as the EPA has done about wood smoke, you know, primary versus secondary decorative kind of situations. And so I think that's really important because as Councilmember Bodie was saying, as she came in today, the gray can get oppressive, and sometimes a little gas fireplace for decorative purposes is not a bad thing. So, and I've tried the electric ones. I have a friend that has one. I'm not sold there. I might as well be watching, you know, during the holiday season, you know, Amazon has their various Yule log ones, and we put that up on our screen sometimes just for fun, but it doesn't have the same kind of,
If I could follow.
absolutely.
If I could follow up on that point, what I also see in like some suburban areas is people are using propane tanks for their gas fireplace instead. So they're all electric, but they're using propane. So, you know, so it's just a question for the design of the ordinance, you know, if people, so first the question is it allowed? And the second, you know, what if there's that workaround where people put a propane tank in for their real fireplace? So just not to complicate things, Councilmember Moritani, but that you made me think of that because I picture this propane tank that's on someone's chimney that I've seen.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Vice Chair Katz.
Yes, thank you very much. And now that I'm clear on what this covers, I'm very supportive also. I think that the bulk of the new construction we're likely to see in Lake Forest Park over the next several years will be multifamily and potentially some duplexes. So I think understanding the duplex question is very important. I like the idea of us finding ways to incentivize heat pumps for our single family homes. And I think we went through some of that pretty quickly, but thank you very much for doing the work on this and putting together that presentation. But I think that there's been a carve out in some, or an exception in some of those ordinances we looked at for restaurants. Was that correct? Okay. And I guess I would be supportive of that. It's interesting, you know, I'd like to learn more about it and to understand how restaurants have managed to comply with ridding themselves of natural gas if they have had to. But I know, and having known people in the restaurant business, that natural gas is, well, as methane gas, as we should really call it, is pretty much how they have to do business. So I would hate to do something that would chase away restaurants from Lake Forest Park. The one other thing that I want to just bring to your attention is the fact that in my role on the Solid Waste Advisory Committee, one of the things that we've learned about our landfill is that they are collecting the gases that form in the landfill, which are methane gases, and actually feeding them into the system. And I think that's a good and responsible thing for them to be doing, because otherwise you get various kinds of pollution around the landfill. And so I just want us to know that that's happening, but maybe it could be directed more towards the utilities that need the natural gas to supplement the hydroelectric power when they need that. But yeah, I mean, but that's beyond our capacity. It's just, something that I happen to know about, and I'm glad that we are collecting that methane gas and it's going to a good purpose. But anyway, I think we have some details to learn about, but other than that, I'm really looking forward to seeing how we put this together.
Thank you, Councilmember. At this point, I think that we're introductory. I thank our colleague for bringing this to us, and I think there's my feeling from the group is there's quite a bit of interest in digging into this deeper. I would say that it sounds as though that there are very I shouldn't say specific, but there are circumstances, restaurants, things like that, cultural issues, affordable housing potentially that we need to make sure that we consider very, very carefully without, so we examine what potentially could be unintended consequences of this. And I think similarly to Vice Chair Cassover's point about we can't control what's going on with the utilities, but I think we can certainly influence policy in that regard as well by being prescriptive about some of these things. So once again, thank you. And we will look forward to another conversation about it in the near future. I did want to make a final footnote on this about the legal question, because that is continuing to evolve. Mr. Goldman reminded us about the Berkeley situation. My understanding it was about the distribution as opposed to the end. Berkeley approached it from the distribution standpoint as opposed to the actual end use. And end use so far has not been challenged, as I understand it. Am I mistaken, Mr. Goldman?
Oh, so I read the Berkeley decision and I did not understand it. So
I will, maybe I didn't.
I will defer to legal minds on that.
Yeah. Well, again, this is one of those things where it's a preliminary touch. So, Councilmember Bode.
Yes, if I could clarify, distribution is the last set of links to your home or building. And so that's usually run by the utility the distribution part. And then the end use would be what you have in your house. So there's like the big transmission system, then there's the little distribution system, and then there's the end user. So just to get some terminology clear there. So that makes sense to me that they were saying perhaps they didn't have regulatory authority over the distribution component, because that's allocated, to the utility company and not to the city. So that's a possible distinction.
Thank you, Councilmember. Okay, let's move on then back to our continued discussion of the governance manual, and just preface by saying that Mr. Furutani couldn't be here with us at the previous meeting, and so he was revisiting the governance manual, and there was the meeting, and there were some comments about the printed version didn't quite capture the subcommittee's work, et cetera. So let me just say this, that I'm going to do my darndest and I will reach out to you all individually if I need to get clarification on subject to the OPMA about specific questions on this, to make sure that we get them included. The reconciliation with multiple diversions of Word, it was kludgy. And then on top of that, then printing it, somehow things got challenging. My suggestion is if you have the opportunity to have the electronic version in front of you, unfortunately, at least two of us do not, but that's a little bit easier. But on the other hand, we can all fill in the gaps. So,
But even the electronic version didn't contain like some of the changes I made.
did you turn on?
So because I inserted a purpose at the beginning and that wasn't there. Remember, we talked about that last.
Yeah, exactly. But that is, so purpose, for example, right there. It somehow, I don't know.
Yeah, but it's crossed out.
I know that
Oh,
that
okay.
was the vagaries of
Oh, okay.
the merge between three documents. That's the problem, I think.
Okay.
So I think it's and all the comments are here. So all your comments here, Philippa,
comments
Larry,
there,
all of these things here. So the contextual nature of it is definitely still intact. And so apologies. One of the challenges we have, of course, colleagues, is that we can't do like a OneDrive or, we can't share a document and then work on it together because that would be a violation of the OPMA. So it is what it is. And maybe the simplest thing is to just take the notes and go from there. I'm doing both. I've got notes in my binder as well as reconciliation here from the two versions that were sent from Councilmember Goldman and Councilmember or Vice Chair Cassover. So let's pick up where we left off, if we could, please, which was I'm gonna go back to my binder because that's where my specific notes are here on this. And we were on page we were still working on page 26, and I'd be happy to revisit anything on page 26 going forward if we want to just kind of restart from there, just to jumpstart our brains.
And here, have this because I left mine at home. Oh, you've got one. Oh,
Yeah. And one other thing I want to bookmark too. Matt, our illustrious clerk, had indicated to me that we should be making sure that we do have specific language surrounding the consent calendar. Careful language around that, as well as a little bit more elaboration on the three-touch rule, because we have been, I think, quite successful at suspending the three-touch rule for the purpose of expediency moving forward. And so if you have thoughts about that, and if anybody would like to tackle writing the three-touch rule guidelines or the consent calendar guidelines, I'd be totally amenable. Oh, Jeff's going to do it. Yeah, Mr. Parago's volunteered for both. Thank you. In all your spare time, Jeff. Appreciate it, brother. Okay, so let's take a look at top of page 25. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you said we're on page 26.
Yeah, 26. This is the last. This is where we stop.
Oh, okay.
Right there.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
I'm on the electronic copy.
Uh-huh.
And so can you
Let's see.
tell me what section?
We are on section. Oh gosh, it's all crossed out here. How do I read that?
I believe it's page 30 of the Word document.
So if you see regular business meetings right below board, commission, and youth council engagement. So it's 4.114.
No, it's just 4.8.
4.8.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Is that crossed out? I can't even see that.
It is.
Yeah. Okay. And this illustrates the fact that, or the point that, again, we're not trying to do a real deep dive here. We're trying to fix some things, make sure that we have, it's been 7 years since we've done this. And it is my firm belief, and I think there are other folks here that would support this supposition that, or the belief that there needs to be a whole scale tackling of this sometime in the future. We just don't have the capacity right now and the time, the resources as well. Mr. Furtani.
I think some of my confusion arises from the fact that the article number isn't included in the numbering system. And yet there are, of course, further breakdowns of the numbering system, like section 4 has a 4.1, even though you're in article 4. So you know, when you just look at the page, it's very hard to tell which article you're on, right? So I wonder if we could just renumber it so that the article number is included as part of the overall numbering system.
Excellent point. Councilmember Riddle.
Or at least have footers and headers that give us what section, article section we're in, so that you have that context. Either way, I think
Sure.
I prefer the headers because then it keeps our numbers shorter, but I agree with Super Tani. We need to have that identification.
Thank you for that. Yeah, let's see what we can do here to, it's very hard. Honestly, I mean, again, this was started, the original document was adopted at what, 2013, been revised twice, and we're 7 years out of the last revision. And so let's go to the substance of it, and we can worry about the numerical part of it. If we can go with the topics, topically, folks, and let's try to be a little bit numerically agnostic in this regard, because I think it might be simpler. So let's start with regular business meetings here. So 4.8, that's correct. I'm going to try to pull this up on my computer so I can make sure I'm not missing something as well. Any thoughts about additional thoughts about that? Again, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel here. This is about fixing things that are broken or procedurally don't work. Councilmember Riddle.
Thank you. Just comparing it to what we actually had in our agendas, we generally don't include all of this in our agenda. We include it in the item cover sheet. And so I guess I would ask if what we have listed in our agenda has been sufficient, as that's what we've been using for many years, and whether it's worth adjusting, or because we haven't been meeting this and things have been moving forward. So has it been successful, or have we had issues? I guess is my question.
Are you talking about B at the top of that?
Going up a little bit.
Yeah.
That's for work sessions. See 4.7.1 scheduled work sessions. A, and then B, agendas will list the following items for each council discussion topic. Is that what you're looking at, council member? Well, that's just for work sessions. The regular business meeting is 4.8.
Yes, and for clarification, our well, I guess this was technically a cow listed today, natural gas ban for new construction. It didn't include all this other items. So let me go back to work session and see what they have. But I don't believe we have this much information listed on the agenda. It's on the cover sheet of each item instead.
So let's see. Okay, hold on, let's go back. Let's go back here just a second. And again, And Councilman Riddle had also asked as well, would you two be willing to tackle the, so we're looking at basically the,
Be for the work session,
yeah,
because we don't do all those things. We
Sure.
do A.
yeah,
We're good at A.
Well, and I think, what the agenda should list probably should apply to all three of our types of typical council meetings. I think there should be some consistency, work session, business meeting, and cows, that we provide the same kind of information in our agenda. And then, of course, the content for each topic will vary, but yeah, I would be willing to work with
okay, so we've got,
Philippa.
let's look at this then. So we've got work sessions. And the other thing I would suggest too is, does this make sense from the standpoint of these items? So you've got for each of them, whether it's a work session, a regular business meeting, or there's these various topics. So schedule, public comment, et cetera, those things should be fairly, prescriptive and ubiquitous across the range, right? I'm not sure why, for example, board, commission, youth council engagement is included here. Again, work sessions are a place for that, but it seems a little bit isolated. That's another thought. The other thing is public hearings. Seems as though public hearings have a very specific set of rules that we need to be adhering to, and our legal counsel as well as our clerk can make sure that we're there. But I think that is very distinctly different than when it comes to business meeting agendas and regular business meeting work sessions. And well, there is a gap here. Yeah, there's a couple other things too.
So if I,
Page 26.
if
Please.
I could.
Absolutely.
So the section on public comment, if we, I'm fine, A seems fine to me. But B, we're not doing these things. And so I think as a council, we need to understand whether, in conversation with the city administration, whether we should take this out. But here's what it says. The city administration will provide a written summary of all questions asked by citizens. The mayor is responsible for providing a city response to the questions and will inform the council of his or her follow-up actions. Well, we're not currently doing that. Now, should we be doing that? Is that something the council wants the city administration to do? Is the city administration feel like they can do that? I mean, I just have a whole lot of questions about that language right there.
Councilmember Riddle.
I believe in the city administrator's report, there was at one point a section for like response to public comment, but rarely did I see anything written in there. So I don't know if that was trying to satisfy this at one point in time.
That's true.
But I haven't seen that section filled out with anything. So just as a current status.
Thank you, Councilmember. Just a little bit of historical context. I remember when this was put into the mix, there was some challenges when there were council members that were individually responding, and it was interpreted as being responded, that the city was responding to individual concerns. And this was to ensure that there was a message that was coming from the administration speaking on behalf of policymaking body and the administration working collaboratively to make sure that there wasn't a disconnect and there wasn't, I'm just going to call it mavericking, because that was what was happening back, in 2011, 12. And that's where this came from. And I certainly believe that it's important for us to tighten this up and make sure that if indeed, and again, I think you've brought this up multiple times, Vice Chair Castover, as Councilmember Bodie has as well, that we have to think forward about future councils and what's going to be happening. This is not, we have a very congenial and civil and engagement together with administration amongst ourselves, but in future councils, things change. 20 years from now, this may be a very different kind of situation. Yes, Councilor.
Thank you very much, Deputy Mayor. It seems to me that having a response to, I believe that we have done and had discussion of responses when we have a public hearing. Usually verbal in my recollection, where say the planning director will say, well, here are the comments that we heard at the public hearing. Then we'll have some discussion about whether we want to make changes in the proposal based on that. For general public comment, we don't always have responses to those. So I just wanted to draw that distinction. The public hearing comments, I think we've had a practice, at least verbally, of a kind of city administration response and then a council discussion about whether to respond in ways that would change the document. But for overall public comment, sometimes a council member will follow up and ask a question, but it isn't a routine practice. And like Council Member Riddle, I do kind of recall that that was like a placeholder in our city administrator's report, but wasn't, I think was rarely filled out in my tenure.
Thank you, Councilor Bodie. Mr. Golden.
Yes, I would be interested in getting follow-ups. Now, for public comment, some public comment is just someone stating their opinion. There isn't necessarily a city staff follow-up to that. But if someone is asking for help, and occasionally a member of staff will kind of talk to them in the hallway afterwards, I would be interested in knowing, like, what was there a resolution? Because sometimes a member of the public will come back and say that there's still a problem, or sometimes they never come back, and it would be nice to get a conclusion to that.
Thank you, Councilmember. And yeah, kind of, this is going to sound a little simplistic, but years ago, trouble tickets, they get assigned to somebody and then they get closed out and there's a report sent out. And so that's overly simplistic because some of these, questions or requests are very complex. So, okay. Absolutely.
I would like to commend the administration because when I first came on council, if there were citizen questions in email, often there was no response. And so I do think that our city administrator and our council here has done, and our management team has done a really good job at responding to those, even if it's just no, we really can't do that response. I think it shows that we're listening, and I for one have gotten good feedback from the community for the fact that we don't usually. It's rare or sometimes a mistake if we, or it could perhaps be just an opinion situation where we don't respond. But I want to commend our city staff and administration for that, because that has really improved in my tenure on the council. And so when they come in by email, we do tend to be responding. So if there's duplication on what's said in our council meetings and what comes to us as council or as city administration in email, it may be covered, you know what I mean? And we may see a copy of it. So it's complicated. There's a lot of layers of this onion, but I did want to commend the city staff for being responsive.
Yeah, thank you, Councilor Buddy. I'd echo that sentiment. I think that, and years ago, showing my age, but there was sometimes no response and disconnected responses quite a while ago. And I think it really has improved considerably. And it's difficult because there's a large volume of things that come in. Some of the requests are a little onerous, shall we say. Councilmember for.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. And one of the things that I thought of was, in fact, at the last regular business meeting, that woman who runs the coffee stand at 104 came in and asked the question about what's happening to that place across the street from us. And if the mayor had not responded, which is, definitely not decorum, but still got the question answered. I didn't see that show up, at least in any city administrator report I'd seen recently. So I think it's important that there is that follow-up, as Councilmember Riddle was saying, that, you know, people who ask questions may get an answer, but it's more than that one person that really probably wants to know the answer to that question, right? So it'd be great if it was publicly available.
Yeah, thank you. And to be completely fair to the mayor, the person in question, Heather, is from Shoreline. They have a little bit different sort of interaction at some of their council meetings there. And two, we sometimes, when we have new people that come into our community, don't necessarily understand that we are not, by our rules, allowed to respond from the dais out of, again, going back historically, out of protection of the citizen, to make sure that there's not a back and forth that could be injurious to the dialogue that needs to happen at large, so to speak. So, but thank you for your thought on that. Any other thoughts on that particular item? And then we should probably continue on here. I think this one we need to. Yeah.
I do think that it's worth clarifying the written comment process, as Larry put in his note there, because I know that when I was deputy mayor, I did respond to citizen emails, but I always copied the city administrator on it so that there'd be a record with the administration of what how I had responded.
Sure.
But I didn't copy the rest of the council because you get to OPMA issues. So so I do think that it's worth somehow documenting, you know, what's the best approach there. And maybe again, that's a conversation we should have with the administration as to how we, you know, whose responsibility is to do these things, and how we should make sure that we're in compliance with OPMA, but also not going rogue, you know,
Right.
as you identified.
I said Maverick, but I watched Top Gun again the other day, so I'm just gonna go. Yeah. Thank you for that. You're absolutely. I think that really is very helpful. So public hearings, I think we're gonna leave that to legal. Yes.
And just as a point, I think when we have something like this that's well defined in our actual municipal code, I'm happy to lean on that more legalese and maybe make some more references so that we don't duplicate content in multiple areas and need to update multiple areas. So just as a general rule of thumb, if we have an opportunity for that, I like to streamline our governance manual that way.
Right. Thank you. Sorry. We're all, yeah, I had a green flashing light here a minute ago. Thanks, Matt. Clarifying what goes on to consent, just in terms of what is allowed to go on consent as opposed to, you know, so it doesn't become a catch-all. And I think that's important. Our clerk had mentioned that the other day.
So clarification, so you want a little bit more information on here for future councils to understand what's legitimate to have on a consent calendar, and to provide some parameters for that? Is that kind of what you're thinking?
Specific. Yeah, very specifically. Thank you.
Okay.
I agree
Okay.
completely. That's exactly what I think is important. And I mean, this, you know, the consent calendar is used for council action items that do not need further discussion at the regular business meeting, either because of their routine, such as contract renewal or have been thoroughly vetted. It's a little ethereal, nebulous, and I think that our if I'm not putting Matt on the spot here, but if I understand his comment correctly and my thoughts, that is, let's be prescriptive about this and have a specific list of things. As always, it's very, very important to recognize that any council member at any time can request an item to be removed from consent. That's absolutely a universal right. And I believe in that very strongly.
So typically we try to do that during the agenda adoption. Is that something that we want to specifically allow to occur after agenda adoption? Oftentimes we'll move things out of consent calendar during adoption. Am I hearing it being more open than that?
No.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that is the standard procedure, and it would be against the
Be very unique.
Robert's
if-
rules for us to be pulling things out after the fact.
Okay, thank you. for
Mr.
that.
Lebo.
Just a couple of comments, and I did want to go back a moment for business meeting agendas. And if there is an opportunity to have a preference that the Citizens Committee occur as early as possible. So before even public hearings or public presentations, just for the benefit of those who wish to comment and not otherwise extend their visit with us during the evening unnecessarily.
There is a D, but it isn't reflected in the agenda list. There is a D that says public comment should be held at or as close to the beginning of the meeting.
Yeah.
So I would suggest that it follows the adoption of the agenda, if there's a preference.
Yeah,
The other is that when asking for approval of a consent agenda, I have seen others ask to see if there are any items that the council members wish to pull from the consent agenda. So it is a request as a process, as one example that I've seen other agencies do. So
I like that.
it's clear as to there's basically a pause. Because I've been to meetings where I showed up 2 minutes late and they'd passed the consent agenda, for which I had no reason to otherwise be at the agenda.
Excellent point. Thank you. I like that, actually. I think it's a great to have a sort of that break and say, is there something that should be removed? Okay. So I was starting to say I do have a note here that add that public comments be moved to the beginning of a meeting, particularly if a large number of people are present. That's my Scrivener's notes, but there's a far more elegant way to put that and make sure that and it's been our practice recently to try to do that, but let's get it in policy too. Okay, let me make sure I get it.
So just to comment, my preference would be whether there's a large audience or not, that it
Doesn't,
just
yeah.
merely follows the adoption of the agenda.
Yeah, this says particularly, I think that was one of your comments the last time, so. Thank you. Okay. Did you have, let's see, where are we now?
Page 28.
No, I know, I'm just looking, making sure that I'm not skipping over something. Okay, executive set, okay. The council member requested agenda items, that one, what we had talked about in our last touch on this, the previous Cal to revisit this. So this has not been our practice for a very, very long time. And I don't know, I don't know where the change occurred. But it was at least 3 deputy mayors ago.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Yeah,
and it
because
never has happened in the now. second
Yeah,
one.
so I'm not sure. I think this should just be, we can rewrite this from the standpoint of saying that if you have a requested item, or that it should be brought to the agenda team, well, but it has to be an item that is, has to be an item that the council has had the chance to, have a touch on previously and have a co-sponsor, et cetera, unless there's some, I can't even foresee circumstances that would require that. But unless it's an emergent basis.
Oh, yeah, I was gonna say the same thing. I mean, I could see, a very serious event that took place and council, in the community at large or wider community, and the council wanted a resolution on or something like that. But as far as, a change to our municipal code or I just can't see that could happen, but I could see a resolution if it was responding to an emergency.
Yeah, I mean, I can give you one example that, and the only example I can honestly think about would have been in my tenure, not as deputy mayor, but as a council member, the moratorium. That was the only one, and that was issues of privacy and everything else. And John Wright, I asked John Wright to be in the mix on that, and then bring it to the mix. And that was an important one. But I don't know beyond that. And again, that was kind of an emergent type of situation. So in very extraordinary circumstances, I don't know. So let's think about this. And I have a note to revisit it. If you have other thoughts about it, when we come back again for, sort of wrapping this up next go round, we can talk about that. But I think this is a little bit archaic, and we'll go from there.
To me, it's a bit odd because we have just other business listed in our agenda, which just allows council members to bring other business to the table, which is typically, and we haven't described it specifically here, but typically not actionable additional business. So yeah, so I haven't seen this utilized, because if someone needs to bring something up that doesn't need to be voted on, it just comes up in our normal agenda portion of the other business. So yeah, I'm willing to revisit that as well. I'm not sure we need it in this way anymore.
Well, like I said, I do think we need to make an allowance for an emergency resolution, a resolution to be brought forward in a very short period to get onto the agenda, be in response to an emergency in the community. So, I mean, in a way, you can think of the pandemic that way. We had to make some very quick decisions about holding meetings virtually, for example. So just those kinds of things that need a very immediate response. We need to make allowance for that to happen.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is the dates that it's, or the days it has here. It sort of implies basically it's what 2 days before a business meeting, because those are the meetings that we vote on. Yeah. And so I'm just trying to, at that point we can't issue a new agenda or anything. So I think we do need to look through this, because what does it all imply?
That's everybody.
Yes, I just want to say, I think we should test whatever we write by the moratorium situation, because this isn't a routine kind of thing.
Mhm.
And we have our process of, if it's we bring things to the council, to the COW, if it's a topic that council members want to broach with the larger group and see what the response is to take to the regular business meetings, but this is in relation to the regular business meeting. So I think that the moratorium is, it wasn't quite an emergency. But it had sensitivity around it. So whatever we do, we should test it to make sure that wouldn't be prohibited. So I'd rather be kind of vague if we have to make sure we would have that eventuality covered, than to be so specific that we kind of exclude that situation, because that was really important from a community point of view.
Councilmember Lebo.
Thank you. I think though that certain aspects of this should be thought of as guidance rather than rules. And that we always, as members, have an opportunity to modify an agenda. Anybody at any, somebody can make a motion to modify the agenda. So I think of this more as a nice to have, if you have something you want to put on the agenda, bring it forward ahead of time. But there isn't anything that would preclude us from adopting an agenda that includes some discussion that we want to have, or during the course of the meeting, ask the council to modify the agenda to bring up a topic. This shouldn't be such that it precludes us from doing our normal business.
Yeah, thank you, John. And just on point with Councilmember Bodie's comment too, I think that one of the tests for me, going back to, for example, the moratorium, and it wasn't emergent. You're absolutely right. It was time sensitive. And emergencies like the pandemic
Yes.
are, we always have that option, I think. I was trying to be very cognizant at the time of keeping the circle very close, but I also fully recognized that I could not do it on my own, and I had to make sure that I had, support of an additional council member. That's why I brought council member Wright into the mix on that moving forward to make sure that I was not. Yeah, and I think that is one of the other tests too, to have that support of an additional colleague to make sure that we're not off base. You had a thought.
Yes, I mean, Councilmember Lebo's right. I mean, we can add anything to the agenda the day of. So the question I think is what is important enough to make sure that as someone who wants to add somebody, that it gets into the normal issuance of the agenda that would be in the normal process that the city clerk does. And then at what point is something that we would need the city clerk to reissue the agenda with something updated, perhaps because we wanted more community input on, so we wanted it to get out there. So I think this is going to be a conversation with administration. And if it doesn't need to go out 3 days before the meeting, because it doesn't need to be posted that way, then we can just bring it up and add it to the agenda at the beginning of the business meeting. So I think I want to bring administration into this conversation, because I don't want to give them a hardship of reissuing new agendas and so forth if it's not necessary, and it would be a burden on them.
Okay, so let's, I'm sorry, did you have a final? Go ahead,
Well,
please.
Just one final. I appreciate the idea that this is guidance. However, I have seen other councils be really derailed by members who just constantly brought
Drop it on the dais.
agenda items that had not been properly vetted, that were not legally sound, that all sorts of problems. So part of the guidance that we have already in the document is to avoid that problem. So I don't want to go there that far, if you see what I mean, to just open it up to people bringing all sorts of things that end up being very unproductive for not only the council, but the community.
Wouldn't it be true, though, that if that was brought up during the adoption of the agenda, then we would vote to not adopt the agenda with those items if it wasn't something that had more council support? So I think there is a mechanism to prevent, as long as the whole council is working. It
Just takes two.
I would disagree with that, Councilmember Riddle, because on a split council with 4-3, there was, I can tell you, for my first 2 years on the council, there was plenty of drop it on the dais. And that was a challenge. And that's one of the reasons why in 2013, the attempt was made to put this into it can be very destructive, I would say, to civility and to the decorum of the body to have that kind of behavior. And I think there really has to be exigent and extreme circumstances for that kind of situation. I completely agree with Councilmember Lebo in terms of agenda items. If it's not for final action or not for, and I know I don't want to speak for you, John. I know that's the spirit of what you're saying. I just want to throw that caution into the mix, and I hear you as well, Vice Chair Cassover. Okay, let's move on from that. We've got 15 minutes left, and it is definitely my intent for us to get done on time. And I have small human, I've got to get to bed here in a few minutes. So let's talk about inauguration. There was no comments from the committee, the subcommittee on that, or I wouldn't call it subcommittee, our volunteers, because it wasn't officially subcommittee. Organizational meeting, governance manual, council vice chair, appointment of committee chairs. Again, that's the same thing that we did last year. Goal setting retreats. And by the way, I just wanted to make a comment about special meetings, because this comes up here, and hang on a second, John. Special meetings, of course, too, have very specific requirements relative to agendas. You cannot change the agenda if it's a special meeting under state statute. And so it's really important. We've come up against that a couple of times when things have been urgent and we couldn't change the agenda. We had to, repost something for a further meeting to make sure that we gave it allotted time, et cetera. Mr. Lebo, I apologize.
Regarding the organizational meeting and the election of officers, rather than the first meeting, could it be the second or third meeting? And the reason for that is, admittedly, as a new member, you're like, vote on this. Because there's not great room for to have any discussion within a council leading up to that. It's welcome, vote. And is it so important that we elect them on the first meeting? I would suggest that it be a
That's what we're riddle.
follow-on.
I like that idea, but there will be times where there will not be a chair or vice chair at the first meeting to run the meeting possibly. We have to accept that might happen. So what happens if you're not adopting your chair and vice chair at the first meeting? Who runs the meeting? And so I guess if we're going to do that, then we need to be really clear about how that first meeting may be run in that scenario.
It is kind of a chicken or the egg question. I was just thinking the same thing, because there will be a committee of the whole before the second meeting, and there will potentially not be a chair and vice chair. But the spirit of what you're saying, John, I'm using that term again, I completely agree, because I think the first meeting is like,
Whoa.
yeah, it's not even drinking from a fire hose. It's like it's a, whatever their analogy, or yeah, it's a different world. And let's think about that. I wonder if it's just a question of timing, in terms of, scheduling of meetings. We have to adopt the council calendar at the end of the year. So there may be a way to, and we can look into legality potentially of, maybe it's this. No, that doesn't work. Legally, that wouldn't work. I was going to say, maybe it could be the committee of the whole that does that. That wouldn't work because the mayor is not, has to preside. So, Chair Cass.
Thank you. So the committee of the whole is a choice that this council makes in how it organizes itself. It's not mandated. It's not by statute. So there could be reason to, in fact, skip committee of the whole.
The first year,
The first month of the new term. And in that way you could do what John suggests and have the second meeting of the year be the meeting at which the chair and vice chair are elected.
Mhm.
And then you'd be ready for the second month. You'd be all set. And that may make, some sense. So just a thought.
Councilmember Riddle, sorry, I'm losing
Thank
my
you.
voice too.
I guess if the intent is to bring new council members up to speed, I think we may be able to, because we'll know the first week of November, hopefully, we won't have races that take long to resolve. The first week of November, we'll know, or first 2 weeks of November, we'll know what our council makeup will be. Can we have a cow which simply discusses what these are, what the roles, responsibilities, just a prep meeting that doesn't elect anyone, but brings everyone up to speed, and then the new council members would attend as attendees because they aren't on council yet. But that way, before we move into the new year, they've got a chance to understand that we have a tree board liaison, and just an educational piece to it, so that they come into January just with a bit more knowledge of what we would be doing. I don't know if that would affect whether we want the first or second meeting to actually do the elections, but I think that would be very useful for them.
Yeah, I hear you there, but I'm just thinking about that calendar problem there, because your cow is on your Monday before the third Thursday.
Yeah,
And that conflicts with both in November with Thanksgiving and in December with Christmas. So you're kind of so we call a special one.
I think we're getting a little little too far in the weeds on this one. One of the things I would say that there is a nuance that could be sorted out. I really do. I think your idea is a great one. Relative to maybe you have a special cow after. You don't have the regular cow in January, and then whatever form it takes, fine. The other thing is, and that could be, remember that the calendar for the council is set by the previous, basically by the previous council. So we adopt that in December. So one of the things that could happen too, then from if there is a vacancy, so to speak, we could have written into the governance manual that the agenda for the January meetings prior to the election of the council chair and vice chair is set by that agenda is set and for adoption by the previous set of folks in case there's no gap. And I think that's really important for us all to recognize that whether, people are timing out or whether they're retiring or whether they're, whatever happens, the vagaries of our world, that the continuity is ensured, that there is, and to your point, Councilmember Riddle, making sure that we have some overlap too makes a lot of sense in terms of education. I do believe that calendaring in December and November is just very, very, very difficult. There's just no two ways about it. And so let's not overthink this too far. We have about 10 minutes left, and then so let's talk about organizational meeting. Again, all of us noodle on this, and I think there's some really great ideas out of this. Councilmember Bodie.
I would like to address goal setting retreat if we're willing to move on. I am mindful of the far off-site retreat, and I'd like to see if we could add something saying retreats can be held off-site, but shouldn't be more than, I don't know, 10 miles from the city of Lake Forest Park or something like that, because we want to make sure that citizens are able to attend and don't have to go far away. So just trying to address that one event way back when, which proved to be controversial before my time, I will admit. So does everyone kind of agree with that concept? 'Cause
Absolutely.
I think it's good to be offsite, but not too far offsite. So I don't know whether it's 10 miles or whatever, but I just threw that out. Because we met in Bothell, right? So at once, and that's not 10 miles away.
Yeah,
so,
Bothell, Kenmore. Yeah,
Bothell,
you
Kenmore.
bet. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah.
Edmonds, they're all within shoreline might have a
I
bigger
mean,
number than we do.
the PIC just met down at Renton City Hall, and that's
Yeah.
18 miles. So,
Yeah.
I don't know. I completely agree. And that was an unfortunate kind of situation, compounded by the fact that the technical difficulties that occurred
Right.
just made it exacerbated the
Right.
angst.
I recall. So, just I think some reminder that we should be close by for public access is good.
And Mike D would admonish us that it has to be on one a single bus route, not a change. So if you're out there, Mike, I'm thinking about you, brother. Okay. Thank you for that, Councilmember. That is very thoughtful, and I we can figure out some language for that for goal setting. Public meetings. I don't think there's a whole lot for us to dig into here, honestly. I think this is a little bit superfluous, but
I guess the only thing I would say about this is does council organize these? I mean, we request them. Yeah. We administration organizes them. I don't know. Because this talks about public meetings being
it's in here somewhere.
public forums,
Reference.
presentations, town halls, and so on. So I just think we should just do a little wordsmithing here to be clear of what our
Okay.
purpose is, but that's minor.
So under Yeah, so public forums versus public meetings. This is interesting. Yeah, let's tighten this up and
I'm thinking of the debates. The town hall debates, which if we have more than the requisite number of, if we have a quorum, it's a public, we have to, announce.
Sure.
It's a public meeting, so when I think of public forum, that's kind of what I'm thinking about, but the council doesn't organize that to Councilmember Riddle.
You're talking about debates before elections?
Yes.
Yeah.
oh
And
yeah,
it-
that's
I
not
mean,
our purview.
We in the past too have had town halls when, for example, when we were developing the Big Five, we had informational town halls where the council spoke and was available to chat with people as they went through and all that sort of thing. So anyway, we'll work on it.
I think
We'll figure it out.
organize for attend could
Yeah.
solve that easily.
Yep.
Just a thought.
Just quickly, Councilmember Goldman, on point. I would like to have a prohibition on sticky dots in the governance manual. If anybody,
Yeah.
would you all support that? I'm,
Pro sticky dot.
oh, okay. Councilmember Gold,
I'm just curious, is there meant to be a distinction between a public forum and a community forum? Because those seem like the same thing to me.
that's why I'm thinking that, so there's public.
Just a very high level. I don't believe anywhere in here do we specify that we adhere to Robert's Rules of Order or any version, abbreviated version thereof. I know there's a lot that comes with adopting that as an official code. I just would, but we do sometimes rely on it when we're trying to figure out what our next step is as a council, when we run into technical hurdles. So I would like to know better, like, how do we define what it is that we're going to follow during these deliberations and what those rules are?
I thought we had a reference someplace.
It's in here somewhere, but it's not very descriptive as to
Councilmember
why.
Very patient. I'm sorry. Larry.
So I'd like to flag section 5.6 on amendments to ordinances, and I think we can tighten up that language about,
Okay.
or should people be doing amendments live? Should all amendments be kind of pre-submitted? But I think we can tighten the language.
See, yes, okay, hold on.
Page 42.
Thank you. I did with my glasses. Okay,
I have two places.
yeah, here we go. Hold on. So,
Okay.
yeah, just give me a second. On my or yes, please.
Um, My other question is, For reminding me.
It happens
We don't want to be.
one time in all these years. So motion to lay on the table, that's interesting.
I don't know if we need that is my question. So I don't know who can advise us on that, but that's my question.
Thank you for that. It seems like there's a historical context to that, but I also think that the historical context may have been something that was not necessarily the inclusion was not necessarily a positive thing. So let's thank you for the bringing that up. And again, this is not all inclusive, folks. We don't have to, but I'm just thinking of things that if we can front load this and get a little bit of homework done in advance, let's and there's a lot more here. So maybe we should just, I think we should probably leave it there, and let's just plan on coming back starting again on page 34 or Article 5 of Council deliberations. And in the previous sections, we have some places where folks were going to do some additional efforts on all of our behalfs, and that would be extraordinarily helpful. Councilmember Riddle.
Looking ahead to Article 6, which is the executive branch. There's some definitions about roles of mayor, city administrator, and so forth. I'd like them to look over that section and maybe provide their comments on it before we get to it. In case they have any insight into that piece of this document.
Okay. And with that,
Will we have
Please.
a new version? I guess this is a point of order. Will we have a new version for our next meeting? Or should we keep this version we're working on? This is a question.
let's keep this, my suggestion, if at all possible, keep this version that we're working on, and then we get to the end. So my thought had been that we would try to wrap up most of the thinking tonight, and then have a draft that we could act on or not act on and consider in the future. But it's very clear that there's more work here to be done. So we will bring it back for another discussion like this, and then we'll bring a draft back. And since you're looking at the humble scribe, my preference would be to get through the whole thing, then come back, have a draft that comes back to you for consideration, if that's okay with you.
Fine. I just wanted clarity about keeping this.
Yeah.
Because I'm using the electronic version, so.
I honestly, my concern is versioning. If we get another version out there, and I'd rather keep it continuous, come back, then we know we have a stepping off point. So if this is amenable.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Councilmember Buddy. Is there anything else, folks, that you would like to bring up now? Okay, please.
Future scheduled last item on our agenda. I simply wanted to put a marker for two things that we have in play that need agenda space. One is the revised draft on reasonable use exemption with exceptions, which was we provided feedback, and that was going to come back to us. And so if we could, if you, Deputy Mayor, could talk to the administration about when that timing might be and share that with us, perhaps even on Thursday. And then going back in the time machine, residential parking permit process. And so we had kind of a rough draft, and there was a lot of input, and I fear we actually had two discussions, and I fear that it got lost in the workload of our staff, because the documents and the presentations were from me, kind of similar to Councilmember Fortani's presentation on the natural gas ordinance. So I don't want to lose that, because I do think that having a process established in light of both Sound Transit and the Lakefront Park property, having a process in place that we can kind of think about, and it doesn't mean that anyone will ever even ask for it. It just gives us that opportunity so that we're ahead of the curve in case there's some community interest. So, and you still have to have a large percentage of the people, and it's in a defined geographic area. I'm glad to make to review the presentation on it. I still have it on my laptop. So if people want a refresher, so I just didn't want it to get lost.
Thank you. Absolutely. And actually, we'll bring that up as part of the deputy next meeting.
And
Thank you.
And I might just note too that the middle housing bills that have passed in the legislature do contain quite a bit about parking and when you can and can't require
Yes.
on-site, and and whether or not there is enough pressure, whether or not there is a lack of on-street parking that would allow you. Anyway, there's the whole sort of thing there that we should
Yes,
probably wrap into it.
It's also chicken and egg, because if you don't require parking, you're then going to have a parking. Go to West Seattle where there aren't parking requirements for multifamily housing and see what the parking's like.
Go to Greenwood.
Just, we're starting to get into a little policy
Sorry.
discussion here. No, you're
Yeah.
fine. Future schedule is fine. I just want to make sure we're careful here because not on the agenda. So I want to be.
It's a relevant issue.
And just to let you know, future schedule as well, Councilmember Goldman and Councilmember Riddle have graciously jumped in and are going to be working on considerations for Healthy Streets program. So, which is also forward thinking relative to what's coming with parking garages and the light rail stations and sound transit and things like that. So,
and I have a question actually for the city administrator. Given some of the bills that have passed and the fact that some of them will require a July 1, start to their life.
take one effect, yeah.
Are you and the planning director seeing any need for the council to start thinking about revisions to our own code in response to some of these things?
Be more specifically, speaking to the duplex, the 1110. I just started digging into that today to take a look at that. I don't think it would be a difficult change. We need to get with legal counsel and just see how quickly now, did they make 1110 July 1st? Because I thought most of those bills were subject to your
Comp plans plus 6 months.
Plus 6
Right.
Yeah.
I was actually thinking more of the misdemeanor drug, what's it called? The great, that bill.
Yeah, that's not
Blake.
a planning director.
No, that's
Blake
true.
decision.
Police chief brought that up already. We'll have that discussion internally, what we need to do. I also want to keep an eye on the governor's office on special sessions. There's been talk about that already, so.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
And on.
I'm also going to be in a meeting Wednesday morning where I'm going to ask other cities about this and who's doing what.
Thank you, Phil.
And if I may ask, city administrator, do we have an updated sort of legislative wrap up from our lobbyists scheduled yet?
I do, and I just got it before this meeting and haven't had time to just forward it. So
Fantastic.
But-
Thank you.
1110. I'm reading 1110 is not just duplexes because of our contiguous border with Seattle, that it's fourplexes. And I looked through it again today, so I want to get some confirmation on that because it looks like fourplexes to me.
Yeah, and then there's the double,
Within affordability.
and there's the double ADU
Yeah,
ordinance
and
as
how they-
well,
how they-
1337, how they mesh.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've got, and just quickly summing us up to Mr. Hill's point that there may be some things that we would like to act on, but we need to kind of see what the precedents end up being, out of this legislative session, because it's been a very, shall we say, a very active, whatever adjective you want to use, feel free, insert here. This is like Mad Libs, but it's been and at times it's been precipitous, other times it's been active, other times it's been terrifying. But all in all, I think it's turning out far more amenable to our city than we thought. So
It depends if the reading is that.
all right, thank you, everybody. We're adjourned.
Thank you.